We're going to have now the first conference of the week.
And I will introduce Valérie Masson-Delmotte. And I want to say before that we are really, really privileged to welcome Valérie Masson-Delmotte. When we think about, and everybody's heard about the GIEC, of course, how actually her name is so close to the notion of climate change, the notion of global warming, and so on and so forth. Paleoclimatologist, research directors at the CEA, co-chair of IPCC Working Group I. Valérie Masson-Delmotte has a background in fluid physics, École Centrale de Paris, and climate science. Her research is focused on quantifying and understanding past changes in climate and atmospheric water cycle, using ice core, 3 rings, as well as present-day monitoring, and climate modeling for the past and the futures. She works on glacial, interglacial variability, abrupt climate change, drought, climate response to volcanic eruption, polar amplifications, climate feedback as sheets. Her research was recognized by several prizes, such as the European Union Descartes Prize, Woman Scientist Irene Joliot-Curie Prize, Thinker-Muse Prize for Science and Policy in Antarctica. High-cited researchers in geoscience since 2014. The famous review Natures put her on the top 10 in 2018. CNRS silver medals in 2020. Milankovic Milan medal in 2020. She is a member of the French Academy of the Technology and the European Academy of Science. She is also a member of the French Haut Conseil pour le Climat. Since 2001, actually up to 2023, she, as I've mentioned, was the co-chair of the working group for the GIEC, IPCC, and has co-supervised several reports, 1.5 degrees climate change and lands, ocean and cryosphere, and the 6 assessment reports to be released on the 9th August 2021. Valérie, it's a great pleasure, an opportunity for us to welcome. It's such an honor. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this invitation. And of course, first of all the best for 2025 for each of you and for those you care for. During this keynote speech, I just want to share my story. When I was a high school student, I was shy. I liked books. I had a passion for learning, clouds, archaeology, and a growing interest for climate science because of advances in methods to monitor the Earth from space, to model the climate system in the 1980s already, and to reconstruct past climates using ice cores. As climate scientists, we have time machines. We can reconstruct the history of the Earth's climate, make sense of what are the drivers, what are the processes at play? And we can also explore different futures. And the image I like to give for a professional career is the image of a river. Imagine you are on a river in an unknown territory on a boat. What is the river flow? It's your personal history, your family, your teachers. It's pushing you on a specific flow. And then you see branches opening on one side or the other side of the river. What do you choose? Do you choose to stay where the current is pushing you? Or do you choose to explore a different way, a different path? Is it a dead end and you have to paddle back and it's going to be hard? Or is it opening a new opportunity? And this is how my own career path has developed. Sometimes opportunities which I took sometimes dead ends where I had to come back to continue my path. And this is also the image that I would like to use about climate change. You see here a common visual showing one indicator of the state of our climate, change in global surface temperature. It matters because that's where we live and many other forms of life. And the stripes show an indication of warming from blue to red. We've already lived a changing climate, but then for the future, what is going to happen will depend on individual, collective, political choices, business choices as well. We can be passive, but if we do nothing, we will have to deal with facing a fast-changing climate. Or we can be proactive. What type of action is needed in front of climate change? We can act on the causes of a changing climate and emissions of greenhouse gases. The intermediate scenario shown here is the current policies, business as usual. This would lead to a global warming level of more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial in the next decade, more than 2 degrees by 2050, around 3 degrees by the end of the century, and even more later. Good news, the high emissions scenarios are now less plausible. They are less plausible because of technological advances to produce low-carbon electricity in a way that is affordable, technological advances that allow to produce batteries and electrify mobilities, action on the demand side, efficiency for energy, for food, progress to reduce deforestation, which is still continuing in many parts of the world. But business as usual means very hard times for all forms of life. We can act more, and we can reduce emissions further towards low or very low emissions pathways. And this is a shared responsibility. But it's not enough. Climate action in all cases means to be able to use knowledge that we have now to better prepare for risk management, for adaptation strategies, for resilient infrastructures, cities, to protect those most vulnerable. It also means losses and damages when limits for adaptation are overpassed. Losses and damages means solidarity with those most vulnerable and most exposed. So when I say climate action, I mean reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that's called mitigation, anticipating to adaptation, and addressing losses and damages, solidarity. Here you see people of different ages, but we could also have shown old trees and forests, coral reefs, whales that have a long life, turtles, elephants, and we have a responsibility not just for human societies, but for all forms of life. If global warming increases from 1.5 to 3 degrees by the end of the century, the loss of species will be increased by a factor of 10. So it's not just a societal responsibility, it's a responsibility for all forms of life. The first 15 years of my professional career have been focused on climate science. And my own contribution to this giant endeavor of observing our climate system, understanding how it works, through process-based understanding, developing models that can help us understand the complex system, its past variations, and its future changes. It's coming at a late stage of a long process. The understanding of our climate started centuries ago. And if you look back at some of these milestones, the understanding of greenhouse gases was built by physics in the 19th century. And their observations in the atmosphere started in 1957 directly. Our understanding of the climate from meteorological networks goes back to the 19th century as well. And I want to highlight two revolutions in how we see ourselves on this planet. The first one was in the 19th century. Understanding climate had changed deeply in time. There were ice ages. They were driven by the Earth's orbit around the sun. This was a clash with religious visions of a world created and always the same. It gave a sense of transformation. With evolution of life and climate change, human history closely interconnected. And the second revolution comes back from the last decades with the understanding that human activities have altered the atmospheric composition to the point that is the driving force of climate change today, to the point that it is threatening human well-being and planetary health. And that's a second revolution on how we see climate and our role based on historical science developments. When was the first briefing to a US elected president on climate change? 1965. The first UN briefing, 1972. The first US Academy of Science assessment of what we understood of climate change, 1979. The first IPCC report, 1990. The Paris Agreement, first universal agreement, 10 years ago in 2015. But you can see that despite advances in scientific knowledge, advances in the understanding of risks, understanding of response options, CO2 concentrations continue to increase in the atmosphere, and global warming continues to rise. My own research has been focused on climate modeling, testing climate models for past variations, which is critical for me for confidence I have in projections. If you can demonstrate, you can simulate the response of climate to past volcanic eruptions, past warm and cold phases, past climate variability, it gives confidence that you represent the key physical processes properly, including outside the range for which you have developed and tuned these models for present day. I've used these climate models to understand past wet phases in North Africa, a period called the Green Sahara, as attested by these paintings you can see here from cave deposits in dry regions today. I've joined fieldwork in Greenland twice to extract ice core samples, the oldest one, allowing to uncover the past 140,000 years of Greenland climate history. And I've contributed to Antarctic ice core projects without going to the field, allowing us to extract 800,000 years of climate and greenhouse gas composition history. At the moment, technicians, engineers, and young scientists from my team are in Antarctica to install new types of measurements to better understand the transport of humidity from the low latitudes towards Antarctica, which is important to understand how the ice sheet grows and how it will react to a changing climate. It does not only matter for Antarctica. It matters because what happens in Antarctica does not stay there. And the fate of the ice sheet is the biggest source of uncertainty for global sea level rise in the next hundreds to thousands of years. I've also used tree rings to reconstruct climate variations, including the recurrence of droughts over 800,000 years in Europe, where we do not have such precious ice cores, and therefore you need other types of archives to do the same type of work and provide critical long-term information. Where we are now in terms of human activities and climate change. You can see here a visual of global greenhouse gas emissions. We know that these are heat-trapping gases. When we emit them in the atmosphere, they lead to an accumulation of heat in the climate system with amplifying processes to that effect. Things to remember. You can see that there has been a sharp increase since the Industrial Revolution, with an acceleration since the 1950s in the emissions of greenhouse gases. It is dominated by fossil fuels, which account for 90% of carbon dioxide emissions globally and about half of the increase in methane emissions. So if you talk about environmental challenges, greenhouse gases, the priority is to tackle fossil fuels. Good news is that CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, which ramped up quickly in the last 20 years, are now slowing down. But we have not yet passed a peak and a decline in these emissions. It's possible this decade. It's even possible in the coming years. It depends on choices, including investment choices. The second most important part is the food system. Our food system is associated with deforestation, use of fertilizers, and livestock, which emit different types of greenhouse gases. Altogether, our food system emits around 1/3 of global greenhouse gases, and it's also very vulnerable to a changing climate, with increased losses in crop yields, spread of diseases, fueled by a changing climate. So we have a specific focus to put regarding action on the whole food system. And it's not just about what we emit, it's about how we interact with the whole carbon cycle. Every year, we emit about 40 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. But we should be extremely grateful, because the natural response of the ocean absorbs about 1/4 of that. The natural response of vegetation on land, photosynthesis, absorbs about 30% of our emissions. So only half of what we emit every year stays in the atmosphere, but then it will stay for a very long term. You could see this as a long-term pollutant, because 15 to 40% of what we emit today will continue to act on climate over a time scale of 1,000 years. And a changing climate also affects the efficiency of the ocean and the land to store carbon. We have already lost some of their efficiency in the last decade. So what do we see? We see heat accumulating in the climate system. And you can see here an index of change in global surface temperature. I show you the latest update until the end of year 2024, with, for the first time, global surface temperature reaching more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But that's just 1 year. And for that year, natural climate variability, played in the same direction as human-caused heat trapping. So when we average over 10 years, that's what we use to define a warming level. We are now at 1.2 degrees of global warming. When I asked a former director of this school, who was Minister of Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, what he thought was the amount of human responsibility of global warming, I asked him, is it 20%? 50%, 100%. He didn't know, and he thought it was small. It reflects the gap between our scientific knowledge and what many decision makers think. You can see the outcome of attribution science, which resulted in the Nobel Physics Prize allocated in 2021 to Hasselmann, a German climate scientist. The methods we use all converge. No single natural variability factor explains the accumulation of heat in the climate system. Our best estimate is that 100% of the 1.2 degrees of global warming in the last decade is due to human activities, more due to the warming effect of greenhouse gases, and a part of it is masked by the umbrella or cooling effect of pollution particles. By reducing the emissions of pollution particles, which is good for air quality, for health, we unmask some of the warming effects of greenhouse gases, and in the last decade, the two factors are going in the same direction, which leads to an even faster rate of warming than previously. When we look at global climate and the imbalance of the energy budget of planet Earth, where does the excess heat go? Most of it goes in the ocean, 90%. What happens in the ocean when it gets warmer? The sea level is expanding. But it's also expanding because of glacier melt of the Greenland ice sheet, and faster flow and melt from some Antarctic sectors. And now that part from land ice is the dominant driver of sea level rise, even more than ocean thermal expansion. And sea level has risen by more than 20 centimeters since a century. The pace was 2 millimeters per year 30 years ago, and it's now increased to more than 4 millimeters per year. So it's an acceleration. What does it drive? Higher record sea level events during storms, extreme sea level, coastal submersion, coastal erosion, salt waters arriving on coasts, and challenges for managing coastlines, which is a particular challenge with respect to adapting to a changing climate. A warmer climate also leads to more frequent, more intense extreme events, in particular hot extremes, directly. So events such as 45 degrees in France, 50 degrees in regions at the same latitude would never have happened if we had not warmed our climate. We see them increasing more and more frequently, and they have serious effects on human health, on ecosystems. Second most important effect, soil moisture or agricultural drought. When you have a warmer atmosphere and a lack of rain, you have more evaporation, more transpiration. It empties the soils faster, and it's aggravating droughts. And that's what we see in regions that appear here in yellow. And finally, a warmer atmosphere can hold 7% more moisture per degree of warming. That physics comes from the 19th century. We understand it perfectly. We see it. And what does it cause? When you have a tropical cyclone, when you have a storm, when you have a thunderstorm event, it leads to higher extreme precipitation amounts and new types of runoff-driven floods for which we are not prepared, because all our flood management is based on, record precipitation of the past, not record precipitation of the future. And these changes in hazards matter because they interact with exposure to these hazards and vulnerabilities. What do I mean by exposure? 1 billion people on coastlines, all critical harbor infrastructures and industrial areas on large deltas heavily exposed to sea level rise. In France, 10 million houses on soils that move with drought, which is increasing the cost of maintaining, repairing housing. This is exposure. But it also interacts with vulnerabilities. And today, half of the world's population is facing severe water scarcity several months per year at least. We also have 3.5 billion people who live in highly vulnerable contexts. Where do you come from? Where do your families come from? Do you know these vulnerable people? Do you know what they need? Do you know how to help them? Do you know how to work with them? That is going to be critical to be able to reduce these vulnerabilities, which is a critical component of effective climate action. So this is what climate research shows. And it's not just based on physics, working on the climate system, its feedbacks, potential tipping points, hazards, but it's looking at how it affects ecosystems, how it affects human activities and societies. And what do we see when we look at these impacts that are widespread and result in escalating losses and damages? We see that multiple physical climate conditions, hot extremes, extreme tropical cyclones, compound dry and hot events that are prone for wildfire conditions, coastal high sea level together with heavy rainfall, compound flooding. We can see that all these conditions affect water availability and food production in a negative way, which appears in red. It affects health and well-being, mortality during heat waves, productivity at work, mental health challenges when facing trauma from extreme events, such as forced displacement. It affects critical infrastructures in cities, especially during floods and after the most intense tropical cyclones, as we have seen recently. And it affects the ecosystems that sustain life and we depend on for renewable resources. In France, for instance, the mortality of forests, of trees, has increased by 50%. We have lost half of the potential of forest expansion to store carbon in a decade. We've seen the 5th mass bleaching of coral reefs. Why do coral reefs matter? They're beautiful. They matter for reproduction of marine life. They matter for coastal protection. They matter for touristic activities. They support local communities, in particular in small islands. So you can see that there is value for nature by itself, but there are also these ecosystem services that need to be protected, maintained, and this is increasingly challenged by the effect of marine heat waves for coral reefs. What we also understand better and better is that future warming depends on us. If we would put global CO2 emissions to zero tomorrow, there would be no future warming. The challenge is not the inertia of the climate system, it's our existing infrastructure. When you build and sell a car that is using oil, it will be used during 15 years, maybe 20 years. When you build and install a thermal power plant based on coal or gas, it will be used for usually 50 years or more. That's the critical point. How can we transform faster our infrastructure? Because the key condition to limit global warming, the main one, is to reach net zero CO2 emissions. And that's a major challenge, where solutions exist on the short term, others have to be invented and deployed for the midterm. The more we wait, the more difficult this is going to be, in particular because in a warmer world, we lose some of our options. We lose the efficiency of carbon sinks. We lose some of the responses that build on ecosystems for adaptation and mitigation.
Please. Shh.
And the last thing to remember, you can translate any goal to limit global warming into a remaining carbon budget, okay? By this close relationship between cumulative past and future emissions and global warming levels. The aspirational goal of the Paris Agreement is to limit warming close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. What margin of action do we have? If we apply this approach based on physics, this rule, it means our margin for action is about 6 years of CO2 emissions at today's level. If we don't sharply reduce emissions, we will surpass that level of warming. And the main goal of the Paris Climate Agreement is to limit warming well below 2 degrees. But if we look at existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure now, especially the development of oil and gas, what it would emit during its lifetime is more than the remaining carbon budget to limit warming well below 2 degrees. So understanding climate physics means now if you invest in new coal and oil power infrastructures, you're basically killing reaching the goal of the Paris Agreement and being able to limit global warming well below 2 degrees. In your professional life, you will be exposed to such choices, where to invest to short-term benefits versus long-term consequences. But that's something critical to understand here. So I'm a paleoclimatologist. I worked on ice core records, tree-ring records. I've been part of the production of these curves that show past changes in atmospheric composition over hundreds of thousands of years in the past, even millions of years, and changes in global surface temperature. Today, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere due to our activities is above anything experienced by the modern human species. To find a period with about the same level of CO2 as today, we need to go back 3 to 15 million years ago. You see how fast we have completely altered the composition of the atmosphere. With a level of warming of 1.2 degrees, the magnitude and pace is absolutely unusual in more than 2,000 years. We are reaching out the level of temperature variations of the current interglacial period where our civilizations developed. The fastest pace of temperature we know in the past, during these glacial interglacial changes, it was 1 degree per 1,000 years. We are now at 1 degree per century. So as a paleoclimatologist, when I look at current and projected changes, what do I think? What do I think? Climate has changed in the past. Nothing new? No. I think of what shaped the adaptation coping capacities of ecosystems. I think of the conditions that are required for stable civilizations, food production, agricultural activities. I think of the migration needs for all forms of life to cope with fast-changing climate zones. And I think that we should do all our best to limit global warming to the lowest possible levels while allowing people to escape the most horrific poverty conditions. And that's the challenge that we have ahead of us. So I've spoken about science, but you can see that I cannot stay in my laboratory doing my own research, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and just that. It's not possible for me as a climate scientist. I have an acute sense of responsibility. That sense of responsibility means understanding, what are tolerable risks, what are the limits to adaptation, and then what should be done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to limit risks at tolerable levels. It also means avoiding inappropriate responses that could create further risks. If you tax carbon, economists always promote this as an efficient market-based approach. You tax carbon, and then the market makes it play, and then it helps low-carbon solutions to deploy. But if you don't consider poverty, energy poverty, then you create the conditions for riots, such as the Yellow Vest movement in France and in other places. If you do not design adaptation strategies to protect everyone, not just the powerful interests, you create the conditions for maladaptation and other risks. If you increase the use of biomass and the pressure on land, you will damage further ecosystems, which is negative for both biodiversity and for climate action. So that's the critical thing, to better understand what are the co-benefits and trade-offs of various response options and provide well-informed information for society. So let's start with key risks. Key risks for Europe, they are related to extreme heat, health and ecosystems. They are related to food production. They are related to different types of floods. And the severity of the key risks increases with the level of global warming. And the risks are specific for small islands. We have small islands related to France and Europe, but we also have small island developing states who are some of the most exposed areas and people in the world. Small islands are more exposed and more vulnerable because of isolation, lack of water storage, more challenging aspects due to livelihoods dependent on the health of ecosystems and fragile food security. Small islands are facing more than others issues of losses and damages with limited resources and limits to habitability. And you can see that key risks, they depend on two things. They depend on the level of warming to come, so how much we are able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they depend on our ability to implement adaptation strategies, adaptation trajectories. It looks simple said like that, but what does it mean, an adaptation trajectory to limit flood risk in Europe, for instance? It means, in some cases, accommodation. You protect existing structures. It can mean hard protection with levees and expensive defense infrastructures. It can also mean retreat, no-build zones, floodplains where houses or businesses have been built, where you decide they have to be moved, and you use that floodplain to store excess water and protect the rest. And each option here takes time to be implemented, require costs and investments, has limits. So in your professional activity and in your private life as citizen, you will face these adaptation trajectories. Which is the best for one sector? Which is the best for one context? How to plan what can be implemented now and in the future? And for business sectors, it's not just the local risks, but the cascading risks through the value chain that matter. So you will need in your professional career to be able to navigate in complex climate information in order to be able to understand how to strengthen resilience and implement in various roles these adaptation strategies. What also matters is that we are interacting with slow-responding components. Glaciers, they take tens of years to adjust to today's climate. The ocean mixing, it takes about 1,000 years. If you destabilize a sector of the Antarctic ice sheet, it will continue to flow during hundreds to thousands of years, and the same for Greenland. So we have already committed sea level to rise in the future, on the long term, by more than 1 meter. However, depending on future greenhouse gas emissions, that 1 meter could occur earlier on with high emissions compared to later on with lower emissions. And future sea level rise also depends on possible abrupt tipping points. If instability of some sectors of Antarctica are triggered, then it could accelerate sea level rise. We don't know yet under which conditions it can happen. We know it happened in the past, and we know it can happen in the future. So when you are a risk manager, when you have to invest in a large industrial complex, when you are a city planner for a coastal city, what information do you want to have for infrastructures that have several hundred years duration? Do you want to have our best case, the colored line for different scenarios of emissions? Or do you also want to have the worst case, no regret, information for robust decision making? So that's what we have added here with a dashed line. What would be a worst case for the largest magnitude and rate of sea level rise, plausible, by the end of this century, 1.5 meters, and then in the coming centuries, up to 15 meters over several centuries. And that information is important to consider, not just, where we have most confidence in our projections, but also what can be the worst case outcomes. Let's take the example of the city of Paris, another example. What could be the worst heat wave in Paris now? What could be the worst heat wave in Paris in 2050? What we show based on climate science is that today, reaching 50 degrees in Paris is not plausible. We have no information supporting that. But in a 2 degrees warmer world, by 2050, it's possible. A rare possibility, but a possible eventuality. What would it mean to have 50 degrees in Paris? Would teleconnections work? No. IT infrastructure is not designed for 50 degrees in Paris. Would bank work? We don't know. Would public transportation work? Probably not, because of railway sensitivity to heat. Would hospitals work and protect people? No. So why is that information useful? You can use it, do a stress test, look at critical infrastructures, and now when you retrofit, renovate your infrastructure for telecom, transportation, electricity, hospitals, air conditioning, and the rest, you can make it more robust so that it can cope with 50 degrees by 2050. So that's how climate information on worst-case possibilities can be useful. And if this is well implemented, if it happens, imagination, then we would be resilient. But only if we use that information now for a resilient infrastructure in the future. Why does amplifying climate action this decade matter? If you look at global greenhouse gas emissions in black, where would we go only with current implemented climate policies? Stable global emissions by 2035, declining in France and in 20 other countries, including US, possibly reaching a peak and decline next year in China, but still going up in India and other developing countries. That's why it would lead to a flat curve. What are the pledges done under the Paris Agreement and the decisions made at international conferences of parties, COP28 in particular? If these pledges were to be implemented, all of them, we would have the red line. And look at the blue line. The blue line is the trajectories compatible with limiting warming well below 2 degrees, a decline by around 30% by 2030. You can see the gap between the goals all governments have agreed, limiting warming well below 2 degrees, close to 1.5, current action, and even the pledges that have been made. That is why amplifying climate action matters. Now, we could say, based on the extrapolation of current policies, what if we do nothing more? In that case, we would reach 3 degrees by 2100. If we implemented the European Green Deal, the Biden Inflation Reduction Act to its end, and all the other pledges, we could limit warming to 2.6 degrees by 2100. And if we would reach carbon neutrality in Europe by 2050, China 2060, India 2070, the non-binding pledges that have been made, then it could be possible to limit warming below 2 degrees by 2100, but only if these promises turn to concrete action in the coming years. This is why we always insist about not just the urgency, I think you've got it, but the agency, the capacity to alter that course, and the options that are available now. And I'll finish this part with that. We know that there are multiple opportunities to scale up climate action for energy systems, industrial systems, urban systems, food systems, and social systems. And they can be thought by considering resilience, adaptation, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. When we look 15 years in the past, there are two striking features. The first one is climate scientists had underestimated the escalation of risks that we see today, but specialists of mitigation had underestimated the availability of affordable, viable options to reduce emissions now, in particular, the reduced cost of solar electricity production, which is truly the energy revolution happening in the world now. It was completely underestimated how quickly this could happen 15 years ago. And now we understand better that we have options that rely on technologies that are available now and need to be scaled up, made available for more people, including with constrained incomes. We have one part of the solutions that rely on nature, ecosystems' ability to store carbon. That's a critical component. And the third one is related to the demand side. It's both efficiency and sufficiency. Do you know what sufficiency is? It's the opposite of always more. Sufficiency is avoiding energy, land, material demands or water demands, while allowing human well-being within so-called planetary boundaries. And we understand that these three levels need to be put forward, all of them. If you only play on innovation, you will never be able to transform systems fast enough. If you play on the demand side, if you provide services that allow sufficiency for the same needs, then you are able to transform the energy, industrial, and food systems in a much faster way. And this calls for more effective mobilization of marketing, management, business, private finance. That is critical. If we look at finance needs, just for losses and damages, those who are hit hard and need to rebuild after a disaster, the needs are estimated to around $40 billion per year. Governments have put kindly 0.7 billion on the table. You see the gap. For adaptation investments in the world, especially for the global south, the investment needs are estimated to be around $400 billion. And for access to clean technologies and mitigation, about 400 billion as well. So you can see the finance needs are huge. We can also see that these are investments with an important return on investment purely economically, even without accounting for the avoided losses and damages in the future. So it's really about shaping a low-carbon and resilient economy, which is at stake now. I'll finish by engagement and justice. I'm not just a scientist in my laboratory. I have different forms of engagement. Do you have an engagement as a student, as a citizen? Will you have engagements as skilled professionals in the future? For me, an engagement means being part of collective life, participation in the social life, belonging to the Republic, involvement, ethics of responsibility, relationship with a common future. And as a scientist, there's a specific sense of engagement because of academic freedom. Academic freedom, it's inseparable from human rights. It goes with the right to criticize, and it goes with social responsibility. So this gives a special sense to engagement as a scientist in society. And many ethical committees have developed a framework regarding the public engagement of scientists in front of environmental urgencies. I've developed a few personal principles for a scientific voice in public life. It's grounded in my strong belief in the emancipatory value of scientific knowledge and a humanist vision expanded to biodiversity, not just people. The integration of knowledge from all fields of science, including social sciences, scientific integrity, building trust, a respectful approach, humility. I've put an emphasis on what we know, but I could equally put an emphasis of what remains to be understood. Ignoring personal attacks, and I can tell you they are widespread. Keep emotions at bay. You may have heard about eco-anxiety. You may want to hear about anger of climate scientists when there's denial, misinformation, when they are not heard. This is also part of the process, and we need to keep emotions at bay while using them to strengthen our perseverance. And I have a personal engagement, together with a professional one, to reduce the carbon footprint of all my activities. So my engagement meant I was part of some struggles. Struggles, for instance, with a former Minister of Education, member of the French Academy of Sciences, who sadly passed away recently, who was one of the most prominent earth scientists in France, but sadly decided to play an active role in the denial of climate science in France. I joined media discussions with him. It was very difficult, and I had to use so-called judo techniques when you struggle with an opponent which is heavier than you, but you can use its own weight so that it can show how wrong the arguments are to the general public. It took more than 15 years for the Academy of Sciences to go above denial, and I was glad to be elected just last year as part of their election process. Going beyond denial is the ability to work with local decision makers in coastal cities who would like to ignore future sea level rise. And I show here the IPCC report on the ocean and cryosphere with sea level rise. That was a heavily touchy topic. And a recent meeting where mayors of coastal cities now take that extremely seriously, start to engage into conversations, democratic discussions related to what to protect and where to move away from the coast. I also mentioned a petition to a former Minister of Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, when he implemented the reform of French high schools, ignoring climate change as part of the curriculum. And that petition had no effect, despite being signed by thousands of scientists. But when there was the movement of students, children for climate or youth for climate, suddenly it was heard, and such change in the curriculum managed to be implemented. And I also show here a view of the French Parliament when several IPCC reports were not shared broadly, but when Greta Thunberg came in France, she was invited to brief French Parliament members on climate change. I was allowed to give a brief overview. And that exact room in the French Parliament was flooded during heavy rainfall last October because it was not prepared, as many of our infrastructures, for the runoff associated with record rainfall amounts. So these are a few examples of some of the struggles where I had to go out of my comfort zone. And I've been very engaged in enhancing climate literacy. Climate literacy, it means understanding the causes, understanding the consequences for what matters for you, for where you live, your professional context, but also understanding how you can take action. What are the options available? And when I look at the general public, I often use the analogy of impressionist painting. When you look at one touch of paint, it can be one press release of a scientific study, one polemics, one negotiation in climate, you're confused. But when you move away from that touch of paint and you look at the impressionist painting from a distance, you make sense of the intent of the painter. You understand where you are, you understand what is new and what matters. So I think we have a role as scientists to help people take a step back from the news and have this broad understanding. But what we say, what I said, it interacts with your beliefs, with your values. You may have values that are egoistic. You may have values that are hedonistic. You just want to please yourself. You may have altruistic values. You care for others. You have empathy. Not everyone has that. Or you may care for nature. That's the most widespread value in common across all spiritual or political beliefs. Every single thing I've said goes through those values. How can I help you get ownership of the facts, considering these values, your values? How can it be done in a professional context? And that's part of that engagement for climate literacy, where I work with schools, I wrote books for children. That's a great exercise for explaining things clearly, especially with bright and critical minds from high school students. I've developed with colleagues educational resources. We've promoted the integration of climate knowledge in curricula, including in business schools. We contribute to lifelong training, and I spent a lot of time on social networks to help share that knowledge. And this is available, including games, if you are interested, to play against the clock and see if you can cooperate for climate action. I've published a number of books, books for the general public, very short ones, more technical ones, poetry. And I've been framed in a cartoon book explaining what is IPCC, how it operates, allowing a reader to see the perspective of climate scientists regarding climate action. We are in a world of misinformation, and social networks play an active part. I think you, as I have to do, need to understand the underlying methods and influences. What are the characteristics of climate denial, science denial? What are the recurrent arguments? And we've shifted from it's not us, it's not real, it's not serious. You cannot hold that seriously. Now, climate science denial has taken a new dimension, which is, giving a sense of no urgency. There are other priorities, there are other crises, there are other urgencies. Take time. It's also polarizing views on any response options, pro or against renewable energy, pro or against heat pumps or electric vehicle batteries or nuclear energy. And you have to understand how this works. Some of these methods are grounded in public relationships and marketing. Some companies, including fossil fuel or meat companies, or governments who rely on that for economy and social activities, have played a key role as merchants of doubts. I remember approving one IPCC report with Saudi Arabia trying to undermine basic understanding of remaining carbon budgets and what they imply. I remember a COP in Katowice, Poland, where the US from Trump, Russia of Putin, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait completely buried out in the framework of the UN Climate Convention the outcome of a report they had asked us to produce on global warming of 1.5. I have seen that, and it's part of a process to delay, to slow down, to make you believe climate action is not possible. But it is possible. And you need to be proactive with respect to that misinformation, to know what are reliable sources, to help in family, friends, professional context, convey accuracy related to climate change and climate action. So as you have seen, I've been involved in structured science policy institutions, including UN-type approval sessions where the summaries of long IPCC reports were agreed word by word, sentence by sentence, with delegates from all governments, building trust and allowing science to shine despite the various conflicted or vested interests that can be present within individual countries. I've worked with hundreds of scientists worldwide so as to digest the state of knowledge from publications into thousands of pages long reports to these short summary for decision makers, which I can summarize in 3 words: seriousness of the situation, urgency of changing pathway because of undesirable futures, and agency, ability to act, solutions that can be implemented, that are available. And because I think you may be interested by these IPCC reports, I've also worked with specialists of artificial intelligence tools, chat GPT type tools, but without hallucinations and citing their sources. So if you are interested to navigate through IPCC reports, you can go to Climate Q&A, ask your question in plain language, and then see the information across these thousands of pages of reports, pointing to where you can go to see the piece of scientific evidence. And you can even dive in, look at the scientific papers themselves, so that you can have access to that wealth of information. Because of the importance of climate science, my fellow co-chair Padma Ujai and myself, we were recognized as part of Time's 100 most influential persons in 2022. This was not for ourselves. It was a recognition of the importance of collective scientific work. And we provided multiple ways to help you get access to climate information. A summary for all in plain language for high school students. A summary for urban decision makers. A summary for actuaries who work on risk management and are our most direct relationship to the private sector with actuaries. We have frequently asked questions per region, per sector. 2 pages, you want to know what's the status of climate change in Asia, Africa, South America? You have access to that in 2 pages. Of our various economic sectors, 2 pages. We have an interactive atlas. You can navigate, scroll through maps for specific climate information. And we have an interactive atlas for sea level rise with NASA at local scale, so that you can get ownership of that information yourself. We've worked towards new research and action agendas. The next IPCC special report underway for the 7th cycle will be on cities and climate change. And we've started that work by working with organizations of cities who are at the forefront of transformations, impacts, and responses. We've worked with people in the culture and heritage dimension, because that sector needs to work more towards climate action and has many resources to do so. And we've worked across climate change and biodiversity sciences to better inform how you can have win-win options and avoid having climate action that is damaging for ecosystems and biodiversity, and we know that this can happen. I've been appointed to the French Climate Change Committee in 2018, just at the time of the Yellow Vest crisis in France. And after summer 2022, I was invited, summer 2022 in Europe, heat waves, drought, wildfires, a dramatic summer. I was invited at that time to brief the whole government based on the state of scientific knowledge at the global scale, but also specific to the French context. And specific to the French context, I was involved in evaluations of climate action, together with the development of key recommendations for efficient policies. So as a climate scientist within IPCC, the role is to be neutral, non-prescriptive. But as part of a climate change committee for a country, it's different. You assess the policy of your country, and you can express recommendations. Following these reports, I can tell you which was the most proactive group of stakeholders. In my experience, beyond the role with governments, it was the climate MEDEF group, so the organization of companies, stakeholders, that works on climate change. And I could see how the private sector has changed, understanding climate science, exploring climate action, the co-benefits, a vision also for transformation. And I have trust that it is possible with strong will and strong push from investors that goes with transparency for the private sector to play a key role in transformations. It also goes with management skills and the ability to implement change at the large scale. So you can understand what I tried to say. Understanding climate science matters. Every half of degree of warming matters. It's not the same world. Now, next decade, 1.5 degrees warmer, 2 degrees warmer by 2050, or 3 degrees warmer or less by the end of the century. These are different worlds, and you need to prepare for that. Every ton of CO2 matters, extra or avoided, but every choice matters. Your choices, they really matter. Will you be part of the problem? Or will you be contributors to a collective, difficult, challenging effort to change path and to implement a low-carbon development for the benefits of all, not just a few, the benefits of all. It's increasingly challenging because of wars and conflicts, inflation, the rise of the extreme right that has played a key role in every continent regarding climate denial and disinformation. And the most challenging scenario for climate action is a world where every country closes borders. It blocks the deployment of solutions at the large scale, it blocks solidarity mechanisms, it blocks clean technological deployment. So beware of this aspect, which is a changing context in which we operate. So as a climate scientist, I understand we have new roles. We work on climate diplomacy as scientists. We work on knowledge co-construction with stakeholders, including the private sector, for a resilient energy system or food system, for instance, through climate services and expertise. And that's the center we've set up around Paris with 1,000 scientists working in climate, water cycle, carbon cycle, air quality, other environmental aspects. We try to institutionalize, professionalize a wealth of interactions we have with multiple stakeholders, and we make that a core part of what is our own research activity, how it informs our research questions as well. And I'll finish with justice. Why justice? Justice between generations, justice between countries, justice between those most responsible and those most vulnerable. Just look at these maps. The map is an index of national vulnerability to climate change. It's red when you live in a highly vulnerable context. Those who have least contributed to historical and current greenhouse gas emissions, these are the most vulnerable communities, and they are disproportionately affected. And if you look at who has played a key role in historical cumulative CO2 emissions, you see USA first, and then EU, now China at the same level. But it's possible that with ambitious climate action, China will never reach as much cumulative CO2 emissions as the US, while picking up a large part of the population out of poverty. Who's responsible? Is climate action restricted to the Paris Agreement? Should trade be part of that? What is the framework associated with exports of fossil fuels? These are the questions being explored now at the International Court of Justice in the Netherlands, where I was part of a closed hearing last November with a few colleagues across different continents. And this advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, where does it come from? It comes from people your age, 27 law students from one of the smallest islands, Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands. And they were thinking, what can we do to help our people? What can we do to help have solidarity, responsibility, responding to losses and damages, the habitability questions? And they thought we could reach out to the UN General Assembly for a case for advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. What are the obligations of states to ensure the protection of the climate system? What are their obligations for present and future generations and human rights? What are the legal consequences, in particular for small island developing states and other people living in highly vulnerable contexts? This is now being explored. If you are interested by the geopolitical context, have a look at the written and oral contributions to these hearings. You can see US and Russia on the same line. No responsibility from historical emissions. Everything starts with the Paris Agreement in 2015. Absolutely no responsibility for transboundary harm. You can see the pleas from oil and gas-dependent economies. Internally, we have clean processes, but let us export as much oil and gas as possible to support economic growth and help people get out of poverty in deprived regions. Look at that very clearly, because all the tensions that we see now in the world, they are very clearly expressed, and some of them amplified by this climate change context. And please don't forget justice. You know, justice. Living in a world with the rule of law, that's a critical part of our democracy. Collaborations between different nations, that's a critical part of stable conditions for business, for international relationships. It's threatened at the moment. We are in a very challenging context at the moment. But don't forget core principles, your values you had as a child growing up. And don't forget this dimension of climate justice. 2025 is the 10th year of the Paris Climate Agreement. There have been advances. Many climate policies would not have existed. We were on track to higher emissions and higher warming levels. But you can see that the glass is half full, but half empty. There's a lot that remains to be done. And this year will be very important for two aspects. Update to contributions, nationally determined contributions within the Paris Agreement, to be revised this spring, with an important COP30 in Brazil, in the Amazon at Belém. And it will show the leadership of Global South countries to advance climate action. And in France in June, the UN Ocean Conference. I've briefly touched about the ocean. That's where there's least progress for sustainable development goals. The way we use the ocean, the way we affect the ocean locally through overconsumption of resources, overfishing, pollutions, but also through a changing climate, heating, acidification, lack of oxygen. We need to understand that we are not just, part of business relationships. We're not just people. We also depend on the ecosystems and life-supporting systems on Earth, including the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valérie. Thank you so much for this opening conference.